Hi, Nick here from Greenspace Zambia with another episode of My Greenspace. And today we're going to be talking about some of the terms that we would normally use to describe different plants. This can be based on their habit, this can be based on their growth type, but these are all very useful terms to then know in trying to understand how a plant grows and the way that it grows. So as part of this, in terms of just if you're getting into plants or if you've been into plants for quite a bit of time, especially for those who've been growing plants for a while, some of these terms are very important to know so that you can understand the character or what to expect from these plants as one goes a little further. If we talk about succulent plants, immediately that brings to mind the fact that we don't have to water them nearly as much as if we're talking about a tender herbaceous or something that is, say, even an aquatic plant. We could not grow an aquatic plant on the land and expect it to grow well. So being able to understand some of these terms will be a very big help in being able to be successful in growing a wider range of plants and enjoying the plants that we have much, much more. Maybe first off, we'll kind of talk about the fact that we talk about annuals versus perennials. So an annual plant will germinate from a seed, grow during a growing season, flower, fruit, and then die after that in its cycle of life, basically. Whereas a perennial plant from seed will grow. In the first 2-3 years, it might just put on vegetative growth as it builds the energy of the plant to eventually flower after several years. These plants are quite long-lived, usually don't produce as many seeds because they put a lot more of their energy into seeds and establishing their plants and being able to survive to the next season. When we look at perennial plants, then we can break that down even further in that we have woody perennials or we have herbaceous perennials. Obviously, a woody plant is a tree or a shrub that forms thick, rigid stems, basically that used to transport water up to the leaves that are held generally higher up the plant, and photosynthate, or the energy that the plant creates with the leaves, down to the roots, so that the roots can continue to function properly. When we talk about herbaceous plants, then we can break that down a little further as well, because the methods that the plant uses to survive from year to year can be slightly different. Sometimes they can form kind of woody underground stems, usually referred to as a woody root, for lack of a better term, where at the top of that root there will be growing points that as the new growth season begins, these new buds will shoot and form above ground stems that usually will then be killed off after that growing season is finished, and it'll survive again underneath the soil. You also then have bulbs that have formed, and bulbs are just kind of like, you have to think about a compressed stem, where the tiny bit of the bulb at the base is the actual growing point, and then the leaves that come up from the sides and preserve the energy are the actual leaves of that stem. So the flower, stem, and leaves will shoot from the center of the plant and replenish the bulb, replenish the stored reserves in the bulbs each year, going on many years. Things like the potatoes form tubers, which is a large storage organ, basically, but on it will normally have multiple eyes, as they call them. These are growing points that can grow. So from one tuber you can get 3-4 growing points that will start to grow. Rhizomes are another kind of underground storage feature. Corms are another, and these generally have one growing point, which will exist sometimes at the top or sometimes at the side and grow out again, allowing the plant to grow on year after year. So something like this alocasia here grows from rhizomatous growths we have this Dremeopsis, which grows from bulbs. And then this orchid here has what are known as pseudobulbs. So kind of in the same structure of a bulb, but it is actually differently formed, and that's why they generally refer to them as pseudobulbs. We also then have succulent plants versus herbaceous. So a succulent is any plant that will store water in its different organs. So this can be leaves, it can be roots, it can be stems, and it stores that water because it then experiences usually a period of drought at some time of the year. The Christmas cactus, the baobab, this kind of curling orchid cactus are examples of succulents. And this one includes where it stores the water in its leaves. The orchid here will then actually store nutrients and moisture in its pseudobulbs, but to a limited extent also the leaves. These leaves are quite thick as well, so they can store a decent amount of water in those leaves. As does the Dremeopsis here, which has quite thick, waxy leaves to store water also. We then also get generally what we would call terrestrial plants. So these would be plants that grow on the ground in soil. And they are the vast majority of most of the plants that exist in nature. Aquatic plants, those that grow either in freshwater or marine environments, and that either can be with their leaves floating on the surface, or sometimes the leaves fully submerged in the water. Then we also have things like epiphytes. These are plants that grow on another plant usually, and that's usually growing on some kind of woody tree. And there's quite a few orchids, even ferns, even some things that one wouldn't expect, like even there's other woody plants that then grow on bigger plants where they can get higher up into the canopy, get more light. Now we have to distinguish, certain things might start as epiphytes and transition to being terrestrials over time. So here in Zambia we have quite a number of strangler figs, and they're called strangler figs because the seed will germinate on another tree and eventually start growing its roots down to the ground, where it then will start to get more established in the soil. And as it grows larger, the existing root system that it's developed will usually strangle the trunk of the original tree that it was growing on until that tree one day is killed off, and all you have remaining is the fig tree that is still standing. So this is where the name strangler fig comes from. We also have parasitic plants. A parasite is a plant that derives its nutrients from another plant, whereas a more standard epiphyte will not derive its nutrient from the plant. It uses that plant as a scaffold upon which to grow. Now, epiphytes are not parasitic, but some parasites can be epiphytic. So there's a bit of distinction that we have to kind of talk about there. So something like this vanilla orchid is, it's a climbing epiphyte. You can see these stems starting to wind up and grow, and it will develop its roots here that will then cling to the substrate that it's growing, usually onto a tree or a vine. And that's the way that then it is able to get its nutrients. The little bits of soil and debris that will collect in pockets on the tree, maybe in between bark area, is what these roots are after, as well as holding the plant to the tree that it's on. These roots will then be able to absorb moisture and nutrients that are washed down the tree trunk. At no point do these plants actually pierce into the tree trunk and take nutrients away from the tree. True parasites usually have no green material. So there's a specific parasite that we have here in Zambia. It's a root parasite of terrestrial trees. It's called Thorninia sanguinea. All you will ever see of this plant is a flower. When the flowers are ready, they'll burst through the ground. They look like little water lilies or even little protea flowers, right at ground level amongst the leaf litter. And I can show you a picture of that to describe. This plant will not produce any green tissues. It's feeding on the photosynthate, or the energy created by the other plants, and taking all that only to produce its flowers. Once the flowers are finished and the seeds are produced, it disappears below ground again. You won't see it again until the next season. We also then have what are called semiparasites. So these tend to be things like the mistletoes, which will grow high up on a tree, have attached itself into a tree branch, producing what's called a hostoria. This is almost like a little drill. Think about it like a little drill that pushes its way into the tree branch and then is able to absorb water and nutrients from that tree in order to grow and reproduce. Now, semiparasites, unlike full-on parasites, actually produce green leaves, or green stems in the case of certain mistletoes, where it's just a green stem produced rather than with leaves. Now, these parasites will produce some of their own photosynthate to augment what they are getting from the host tree, but they don't produce roots that end up going into the ground and absorbing for themselves. They get all of their moisture needs from their host tree. Then, kind of as another one, we can talk about evergreen versus deciduous. So an evergreen plant throughout the year will maintain its leaves in some form or another. So sometimes you get a changing of the leaves as new ones produced. Some of the oldest ones are shed, but it's always green. And this term is quite often applied to trees, especially those that are in the conifer family in temperate zones, whereas here in Zambia, where we have a subtropical climate, we have broadleafed trees that do remain evergreen all year round. So things like the Natal mahogany will keep its leaves all year round, whereas something like the pod mahogany, which is another one of our indigenous trees, will drop its leaves, and thus those ones are called deciduous. So trees that drop their leaves for a period, it might not necessarily be a long period here in Zambia, will be referred to as deciduous. Those that keep their leaves are evergreen in that scenario. So that is kind of a bit of a brief chat about some of the descriptive terms that we use when talking about different plants. I'm sorry, there's going to be more that I haven't talked about in this video. I can't get to them all, unfortunately. It is a very big kind of part of botany and horticulture in being able to describe these plants. So this was just kind of a little brief video on some of the more common things that we would use to describe plants.